So good afternoon, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation. This is a seminar in our series of seminars on depolarization in religion and ethics. Today we have the pleasure to listen to the talks of two distinguished scholars, Dr. Valeria Fabretti from the Center of Religious Studies, Bruno Kessler Foundation, and Professor Bernd Kortmann, Director of the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies. Let me introduce our first speaker first, Dr. Valeria Fabretti, who is the first announced speaker in the poster of this seminar. Professor Valeria Fabretti's PhD, Dr. Valeria Fabretti's PhD in sociology, and since 2017, she has been a researcher at the Center for Religious Sciences, the Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation. Here, she coordinates research and action programs concerning discrimination and social inclusion, with a particular focus on the case of religious minorities and the role of religion in plural and interconnected societies. In her studies, she applies a sociological perspective with a culturalist angle to the analysis of forms of intolerance and hatred and the ways of coexisting with diversity to be applicable to the case of public institutions, education, and collective space. And today she's going to participate with a talk within this comprehensive title, Religiously Motivated Hate Speech, an Intersectional and Linguistic Reading. So I'm very pleased to give the floor now to Dr. Valeria Fabretti.
Thank you, Massimo, and welcome everyone. Thank you for participating to this seminar. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to discuss with you two main concept notions that are kept together in my title, Hate Speech and Intersectional Perspective, Intersectionality, that are largely used in the last decades, also in social sciences and beyond, and that we at the Center for Religious Studies are trying to analyze in a critical perspective to assess whether they are somehow useful to better detect issues regarding religion and polarization in our societies. So I will start by sharing my screen and presentation. Hoping it works. Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, so my talk will be specifically on the intersectional side of our reflection today, and I will move by some introductive remarks. Although there is not a unique definition of hate speech, as we know, we know that there are some crucial elements, key features that identify this communicative act, and hate speech can be defined as persecutory, hostile, and offensive expressive forms. This is a shared definition, considering not only speech but also single words like denigrating epithets, images or symbols directed towards an individual or a group on the basis of certain perceived attributes. Distinctive elements of hate speech are the tone or the style of the message, intentionality by the part of the sender of the message, the presence of a target, and a supposed effect on it. In consideration of the particular proliferation in the era of the web of hate speech online, a lot of discussion has been made about how hate speech is accompanied by the idea of an increasing polarization of public discourse mediated by social networks or other digital spaces. And several studies also done in Italy based on the detection of hate speech online have demonstrated polarization, showing that while the number, especially in the very last years, while the number of hate speech messages tends to decrease, or it seems so, the intensity of the hostility in the messages tends, on the contrary, to increase. And in particular, how we have explored in different ways through this series of seminars here at the Center for Religious Studies, this polarization is accentuated in reference to issues involving identities and controversies referring to religion and religious belonging occupy a large space in this instance. So a great debate concerns hate speech regulation and the possible collision with the protecting freedom of speech, expression, or thought. The discussion on whether democracies should limit themselves through the introduction of bans for the regulation of hate speech mostly turns around the famous harm principle introduced by John Stuart Mill that holds that the action of individuals should be limited only when there is a definite risk of damage either to an individual or to the public. However, as we know, not all the forms of hate speech can be interpreted as a clear incitement to hatred or violence. Instances of hate speech, such as for example, the displays of hostile or offensive symbols like Nazi swastikas, for example, do not always involve clearly the kind of harm, actual, traceable, imminent, or likely that, according to this harm principle, would warrant, for example, a state intervention or a ban. However, many scholars, especially critical race theorists, have recalled the performative dimension of language and argued that the harm principle should be applied to the indirect and symbolic effects of hate speech on its targets as humiliation and offense. In this sense, being called, for example, nigger or kika, to mention an anti-Semitic insult, will be like receiving a slap in the face. And also Jeremy Waldron's idea of hate speech as a slow-acting poison, which becomes a disfiguring part of the social environment, can be mentioned in this regard. I retain that these arguments have a substantial sociological validity. However, they risk to be formulated in an excessively abstract manner, irrespectively of the social and political context in which hate speech arises, as it is perhaps for the reference to the abstract idea of human dignity. And in this, the metaphor of poison seems inappropriate because, differently from the case of the harm produced by a bee sting, we cannot consider the harms attributed to hurtful expressions as such, but we need to examine its implication on specific targets and contexts. So, given the complex understanding of religion and religious adherence, the reference to the context appears to be particularly important in analyzing the case of religiously motivated hate speech, and in particular that of hate speech targeting religious groups or minorities, the object of my contribution, often addressed on the basis of their beliefs, values, percepts, practices. My talk is an attempt to better disclose, at least in part, the nature of the mentioned indirect or symbolic effects of hate speech. And to this aim, I discussed the value of intersectionality that we at the Center for Religious Studies have examined within the European project INGRID, Intersecting Grounds of Discrimination in Italy. In this case, I refer to intersectionality as a tool that can possibly help identifying more precisely some of the mechanisms involved in such implicit and apparently untraceable chain of effects triggered by hate speech. So if the intersectional idea has, as we probably know, its roots already in the claims of the early 20th century on the condition of doubly marginalized Black women, marginalized as Black people and as women, especially in the US context. In the late 80s and early 90s, this reading of discrimination became established in US legal theory, especially through the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. And then in recent decades, it has transited into international and cross-disciplinary reflection. In a nutshell, intersectionality aims at critically observing and explaining how different categories or grounds overlap and interact in the situated personal identity and social condition of people, oppressed group or individual, retroacting on them with unique, original, and particularly evaluable discriminatory effect. We may say in social sciences, intersectionality finds a very mature ground, I would say, since many approaches have long since profoundly rediscussed the idea of identity as a set of distinct affiliations, proposing instead a dynamic vision in which co-presence, negotiation, and ambiguity are fundamental features. It is sufficient probably to mention that the concept of intersecting social circles elaborated by one of the fathers of sociology, Georg Simmel, back in the early 20th century, to explain the multiple and dynamic determinations of the individual in differentiated societies. So what is new with intersectionality? I think a possible way to define the value of this notion in social science is a sort of mindset, more than a set of concepts. There is the intention to systematically consider multiple identities and subjectivities in conjunction, in relation with the position that individuals and groups hold within a system of power and domination. This is the notion of positionality. So keeping the focus on this reciprocal construction of identity and positionality probably allows to better grasp, on the one hand, how subordination enters into subjectivity and affects intersubjective relationship, creating situation of greater vulnerability. And on the other hand, how social positions are always redefined along the changing axis of identification that affect the biographical experience of everyone. In this, there is also room for considering agency, because it's clear that individuals present always in their condition not only an intersection of vulnerabilities, but also of resources and the possibilities to play a role and change situation in the different life contexts. The interpretative possibilities, these possibilities offered by intersectionality seems to fit well, I think, in the critique of the ethnocentric idea of modernity, and in the discussion of secularization as a concept able to explain only partially the role of religions in our society. I think in this scenario of plurality, there is the need to adopt less generalizing and more relational interpretative schemes, which opens up the possibility of grasping the different contexts and forms by which the relationship between the religious and the secular is given. And in this purpose, although the religion category appears to be underestimated overall in intersectional studies, in the European context especially, there is a fertile ground for its recovery, since the big three categories, gender, race, and class, on which many studies in the US context have focused, tend to be replaced by a more articulated set of grounds of discrimination. So the attention to the selection of the categories in the intersectional studies and the invisibility of some of them can lead us to recognize the importance of also bringing the category of religion, and more specifically the belonging to a religious minority, under the radar of intersectionality. But how shall we refer to the concept of minority? That is, of course, another contested notion in recent social studies. Still in accordance with the intersectional lens, the notion of minority appears to run the risk of naturalizing or essentializing what instead is, we may say, with the ethnomethodology of Harold Garfinkel, the results of designating activities done by others. Others determine a status of minority for that group. So in this sense, we can consider the minority status as a condition of subordination, which is a result of social forms of dominance and othering, the creation of the other, and the result of minoritization processes based on the intersection of multiple grounds of discrimination. In particular, to the purpose of my contribution, I would like to stress that the designation of a group as a minority works not only in force of objective and tangible structural limitations imposed to that group, for example, the lack of access to rights, but also in force of cultural and symbolic processes, namely the diffusion of negative imaginaries, representations concerning that group in a given society. And again, in this sense, intersectionality helps because, in particularly, it is probably helpful, the concept of representational intersectionality, formulated by Crenshaw, to refer to multiple stereotypical views and de-humanizing prejudice that affect a group on the basis of the intersection of negative representations concerning the categories to which the members of the group belong. Different studies have contributed, for example, to the reconstruction of imaginaries regarding Black women in different types and in different times and societies, and it's not difficult to grasp how this type of discrimination affects today in Western societies. Can affect figures as the Muslim migrant or the woman who wears the veil. And so now many studies are offered exactly this kind of reconstruction of the social imaginaries and narratives associated with these figures. So moving from these premises, I will attempt to look more precisely into the symbolic harm in hate speech that can be considered a consequence of representational intersectionality applied to religious groups. Firstly, I will underline a fundamental intersection that may interest religious groups, that of the group social status and the kind of group affiliation, to enlarge then the view to more articulated intersections. Okay, so as well known, the status of a group in a sociological perspective include as constitutive features not only structural conditions like economic possibilities or power, but also honor and privilege. So that there is a symbolic set of resources that indicate that are associated to the social status of a group. Honor and privilege that the group holds in the social hierarchy. A group might be said to occupy a high position not only when it's able to control other groups' conduct, but also when others esteem its role and conduct. We might add, referring again to Garfinkel's terms, which have combined this Weberian view of status with ethnomethodology, that the reference of the status, of the social status, are not features of the social status per se, of the entity designated, but are features of the activities of designation. And obviously, the two dimensions are proper or internal of the social status are not fixed, and they influence each other. On the other side, a religious affiliation as well is a multidimensional concept. We have not too much time to enter in detail regarding the large debate on what religious affiliation can mean, but in broad terms, we may consider that affiliation has to do with a set of goods, values, traditions, practices, symbols, rituals that are shared by the members of the group. And if it's true that members refer to those common goods through the mediation of their own individual meanings and in combination with other sources of identities, at the same time, the reference to those common goods is constitutive of at least a part of their identities and of the identity of the group as a whole. So those common goods are fundamental to the construction and preservation of the identity. Now, this aspect makes the classical distinction between attacks on religious groups and attacks on groups' belief not so clear-cut as it is probably in a juridical purpose. Juridically, in fact, where is an attack on religious group, if sufficiently hateful and extreme, is often a punishable offense. An attack on groups' belief is typically considered an allowable speech. Instead, viewed from the sociological perspective, the issue is not clear-cut, and the idea of a symbolic harm inflicted by its speech on religious groups should be explored, taking into consideration the impossibility to distinguish of a distinction of the two elements. And hate speech in this, we can consider that hate speech directed at religious minorities typically addresses those common goods shared by religious groups that are particularly crucial in order to attribute or neglect to that group prestige and honor. So the very target of its speech is this area of intersection between the symbolic resource of social status and the common goods that make affiliation to that religious group significant for individuals. Hate speech works in this zone by defining the social legitimation of key common goods and then attributing prejudicial undesirable traits to them and consequently to the group as a whole, neglecting its internal complexity and plurality, as for the case of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred, where undesirable traits are mostly linked to beliefs or practices considered dangerous or not compatible with democracies, and that are attributed to a generic idea of Muslim community, neglecting the high diversity of traditions among and within Muslim communities. So I'm trying to argue that this dynamic demands the standing of the targeted religious groups affiliated as legitimate members of society. This idea is represented here in a different way, in a different graph, where just to underline how the harm in hate speech can be particularly relevant, high, conspicuous for those individuals who accord a large relevance to the collective dimension of their religious affiliation. Something that we tend to disregard, I would say, if we consider religion and religious affiliation from an ethnocentric, namely Western secularized perspective. For them, for this kind of affiliated vulnerabilities increased primarily in force of the deterioration of social status for the religious groups they refer to. And in fact, individuals' identity is reinforced or defined also in reason of the value that is commonly attributed in society to those goods with which individuals deeply identify, as we were saying. More in an intersectional view, we can also disclose that for these individuals, vulnerability may increase at the intersection with certain additional variables, additional identity features related to the individuals, of the individuals and or of the group as a whole, to which negative representations are also attributed. The harm is higher, and not by chance. Typically, severity of messages multiplies when hate speech targets members of religious minorities that are of female gender, coming from ethnicities that are also object of racism, or from historically oppressed groups, immigrants, young people, and so on. So the exploration of this intersection is, I think, largely to be followed still. Perhaps the most investigated case of this intersection is the case of women, Muslim women wearing the hijab, the veil. But it is certainly emblematic case, but it cannot, I think, exhaust the scope of reintroducing religion and the religion variable into the analysis. For example, the recognition of social conditions related to religion in the intersectional perspective would allow us to deal with additional and multiple issues, such as, for example, the set of negative representations and the consequent restrictions of freedoms for inmates populating our prisons, often with a migratory background. But the cases are many there are many other cases that, for example, we encountered during our field work for the Ingrid project I have mentioned, where many examples of intersectionality, including religion, as a source of marginalization emerge. And significantly, the awareness by social workers and organizations active in the anti-discrimination field has shown to be very weak in this regard. So in light of this consideration, we may identify that the harm is in hate speech is precisely to culturally reinforce social hierarchies, and as anticipated, in particularly hate speech reinforces the minoritization process of certain religious groups based on the intersection of negative representations regarding multiple aspects: the kind and grade of affiliation to a religious group, the group's social status, and other identity aspects of the group and its member. More precisely, and drawing also from political philosophy and the theories of recognition on which I have worked, and also in collaboration with other colleagues here in FBK, and I'm thinking in particular at Boris Remer, my colleague at the Center for Religious Studies. We are trying to explore the helpfulness, the useless, the utility of the recognition theories to reason on the status of minority. Using recognition theories, we can reconsider minoritization as a form of denied recognition or misrecognition that is somehow made explicit through the communicative act in hate speech. We cannot enter into detail regarding recognition theories, but this is sufficient to say that here I refer to misrecognition and to recognition in accordance with the idea of Axel Honneth of respect. That is an interpersonal attitude in which the interlocutor, being an individual or a group, is taken to be a full-fledged partner in interaction, a subject socially and normatively deserving of consideration. On respect, we can also say that in contrast to the attribution of esteem, that is a less formal and a more substantial mode of recognition, respect does not necessarily presuppose consideration of the other or her identity as ethically appreciable and shareable. In other words, recognition as respect does not require adherence to and the assessment of a positive moral judgment. That especially in the case of religious convictions or practices can be probably too demanding. So it's not about the assessment of a positive moral judgment, but about the possibility to offer equal chances to be considered and evaluated as a possible candidate for esteem. So respect presupposes the attribution of autonomy, responsibility, or we can say also agency to the other, and to recognize his room for maneuver and take seriously his experience or point of view. In this sense, we can say hate speech targeting religious group may reinforce their minority status and subordination, neglecting respect to them, which means undermining their standing as legitimate actors in the game of society. If so, the symbolic representational harm inflicted to the target group as a multidimensional has a multidimensional and interrelated nature, which is the harm exactly. The harm has to do on firstly with the consequences on the group self-representation and on what has been called the identity of the excluded. Again, following Honneth, misrecognition or the lack of recognition may inflict harm in terms of self-disesteem for the target. Similarly, some studies on hate speech have highlighted that when victims of hate speech internalize the hatred directed at them, can display forms of self-hatred and self-disesteem. Other studies have instead have stressed the so-called silencing effect on the victims. That is the effect of discouraging people from voicing their opinions publicly. And it works, it seems, also for members of religious or ethnic minorities. This effect would be the result of an impaired sense of their status, exactly, even if such victims still preserve their formal rights to participate in public arena. So this is clearly what Crenshaw had called intersectional disempowerment. Similarly, disempowerment can also be intended as, for some, as unawareness of subordination deriving from being socialized into submissive status. And still some studies have highlighted how this can affect also religious minorities. So there are forms of domination which, being the product of manipulation and cultural representations, remain invisible to their victims. Now, there are also other effects on other aspects relevant of the harm, the symbolic harm inflicted by hate speech that have to do instead on the fact that there are always listeners and audience of hate speech. So people who do not belong to the target group, and for them, and that of course are overexposed in these years to hateful messages. And for them, the consolidation of prejudice and distance from the targeted group is of course the most obvious effect. But we can also recall the contextual effect of normalizing hate among listeners. This is something we observed in a study we made on the attitudes and approach of young people to hate speech. This seems to, in a way, to be socialized to hate at the point that they do not recognize often that a message can be interpreted as hateful. At least we have different interpretation. There is probably an adult interpretation of hate and different others shared within the youth cultures. So to conclude, I've tried to suggest that hate speech may cause a disproportional impact, namely reinforcing subordination through a minoritization process based on social discredit for specific groups in specific social environments. This leads to consider the importance of a context-related approach in evaluating the harm in hate speech. And I think this approach can suggest also to disclose possible depolarization strategies that go beyond the ban's claim and the regulation of hate speech. So the polarization in this sense can be interpreted as depowering this symbolic and direct harm of hate speech on a religious group. And again, drawing from the theories of intersectionality, I would like to briefly recall just two relevant tools that have been largely discussed in those studies of intersectionality, on intersectionality that are more giving more attention to social intervention and to social action, and that conceive intersectionality as a social project for change, I would say. The first is cultural resistance and self-representation. In her book, Intersectionality as a Critical Social Theory, Patricia Collins stresses that intersectionality as a project for social change includes production of new knowledge. Collins refers to forms of cultural resistance in which subordinated groups bring new knowledge with respect to their very status in opposition to the unjust representation shared by the dominant groups. The importance of self-representation by the oppressed group as an intersectional cultural source shall thus be emphasized. And secondly, coalition. And here we can recall the work of Mary Matsuda, internal to the critical race theory. The point here is to foster shared bottom-up engagement and the development of coalitions among differently discriminated groups in struggles for rights, and we can say also in struggles for recognition. So just a very final comment in our fieldwork, in the fieldwork we made for the Ingrid project. This point appeared to be very, very important because we observed that there is still a very limited cooperation with religious organizations, religious minorities, by the part of those actors mostly engaged in the contrast of discrimination in Italy. So probably there is a certain difficulty in rely also on the collaboration with religious minorities. And this is mostly due to a difficulty in handling with religion, the religion variable, as I was mentioning before. And there is the need to reinforce the link between movements of other minorities and religious minorities. I stop here and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valeria, Dr. Fabretti. A virtual and a real applause for pointing out the importance of sociological study of hate speech, and also the heuristic potential of the concept and notion of intersectionality for carrying on new studies, having new perspectives on this important phenomenon of present-day society. We're going to now give the floor to Professor Bernd Kortmann, who will have a mostly linguistic perspective on hate speech. Let me introduce him properly. Professor Bernd Kortmann is Professor of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Freiburg, and since 2013, Director of the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Studies, FRIAS. He co-edits two international book series and the distinguished journal English Language and Linguistics. Bernd Kortmann holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Finland and is an elected member of the Academia Europaea, which is one of the most prestigious academic institutions, groups in Europe. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to Professor Bernd Kortmann, and I thank him very much for joining the Bruno Kessler Foundation in order to share his knowledge with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Massimo, and thanks a lot to all of you for joining me in this presentation. I think it will nicely complement and in certain respects add on to what Valeria has just presented. I guess the most challenging part will be the first 3 minutes when I'm trying to overcome the technical problems, because I've never worked with Google Meet or whatever, but I gave you the tiny URL in the chat. So, I mean, you at least will be able to see my presentation, even if I perhaps don't. So I'm trying to share my presentation. Once again, Massimo, I click on this little thing here and it says I should present on the whole screen or just one window.
Yes, exactly. You just press on the little screen with an arrow, and then you choose to present your whole screen, and then you move to the screen that you want to present. For example, if it's a PowerPoint, you move to PowerPoint, and we'll see the PowerPoint that you will see as well.
Because my computer tells me I can't share the screen, so it just...
Oh, it's okay. I will share it for you. No worries.
I'm lacking the authority to do this, it says.
No worries. I'll do it for you. Let me retrieve your presentation first.
But by way of introduction, I can just say that, so I'm not someone who studies hate speech all day long, but I rather sort of started busying myself with hate speech about a year ago when I was asked to actually present exactly the linguistic ways of identifying hate speech and of dealing with and spotting hate speech for a conference of people who looked at law and religion. And so I just looked at the kinds of methods that linguistics has, and I also selected then some specific examples of religion-based hate speech. But I must say, ever since I busied myself with this, I myself am more a person who looks at dialects, at varieties of languages, at language typology. I must say, especially hate speech has become more and more important to me, especially also as part or as one extreme in discriminatory language use, and also in fighting tendencies that we have increasingly once we look at the dangers of freedom of academic discourse. So this is why what started as a kind of I don't know. I hear many sounds, but I hope I'm louder than these sounds. What I took away from this engagement then with religious-based hate speech was really that I think this is an important issue, not just for linguistics, but I think for all of us to deal with in our individual academic environments. It's just one extreme, but we also have all sorts of other types of language use in our institutions increasingly that endanger freedom of academic speech. But today we want to focus on hate speech and religion-related hate speech. If we just go to the second slide, the overall spirit that I've done this presentation in, and I would like to do it in, is to showcase some concepts, theories, methods, and approaches which linguistics provides for detecting and classifying hate speech and related types of speech. And I would like to show how one can implement linguistic approaches and methodologies in the study of this phenomenon. On the next slide, you see the structure of the talk, but we don't have to, I don't want to comment on this in any great detail. I will simply look at the watch, and let's say in half an hour from now, I will see where I am, and but I'm sure we'll manage 85% of the talk, and I will take shortcuts wherever necessary. What I would like to do first, in my first part, is to look at hate speech as a term and some related terms and concepts. So on the next slide, then you see that we have terms like hate speech, cyber hate, cyberbullying, toxic speech, dog whistles. And hate speech clearly is at the top end of such a continuum of offensive and potentially personally and societally dangerous speech. And out of these different terms that you see here, I would like to comment briefly on those in bold print. So on hate speech, on toxic speech, and on the somewhat funny term that you may not be familiar with, namely dog whistles. So on the next slide, and the next two slides, in fact, you see some definitions of hate speech. Valeria already also addressed this, and I don't want to make this a big business. Quite a number of definitions are around. There is no universally accepted definition, but even if you look at different definitions, there is a lot of agreement among them. We actually see, for instance, in the first bullet point that according to the United Nations General Assembly definitions from '66, hate speech ultimately amounts to an advocacy of discriminatory hatred, which constitutes incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence. If you compare this with the following definition by the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers definition from '97, you simply see that this is far more differentiated, okay, but it amounts to the same, but it's much more differentiated and inclusive. Perhaps short again is the EU definition from 2008 from the Council of the EU at the bottom. So all conduct publicly inciting to violence or hatred directed against a group of persons or members of such a group defined by reference to race, color, religion, descent, or national or ethnic origin. If we just go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight there the definition that you see in the middle. So what is it that Facebook and Twitter, for example, consider as hate speech? So these social networks adopt the definition of hate speech along the same lines of prior literature, and inspired by social networking, community standards, and hateful conduct policy, they consider as hate speech direct and serious attacks on any protected category of people based on their race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sex, etc. So here we have just a number of crucial elements that definitions of hate speech have. You can now, if you have a closer look at hate speech, and this is on the next slide, subdivide hate speech on the one hand into hard and soft hate speech, and on the other hand into directed hate speech and generalized hate speech. Hard hate speech on the next slide is hate speech that is prosecutable by the law. But of course, most of what we see is soft hate speech. And this is in particular what linguists are interested in, because this is particularly hard also to identify. So soft hate speech is lawful, but it raises serious concerns in terms of intolerance and discrimination. And the interesting thing is, if one looks at different countries, and also if one asks, well, what is really soft and what is hard hate speech, what is legally prosecutable and what is not, the threshold for distinguishing between these two types of hate speech differs from country to country. And this is really one of the most difficult things if one looks at it, for instance, from the US perspective or from an EU perspective, and within the EU, for example, from a German perspective or from an Italian or Spanish perspective. So we don't want to discuss legal issues here, but one needs to see that this difference that I simply make on the slide is in fact different from country to country, and certainly there's a great difference between EU and the US. Okay, what I would like to look at more closely, however, is on the next slide, the distinction between directed and generalized hate. So directed hate is directed towards specific individuals, whereas generalized hate is, I guess, what Valeria was mostly talking about. So hate speech that is directed towards a general group of individuals sharing a certain characteristic. You actually see then on the next slide one thing that one can observe, for instance, namely that directed hate speech tends to be more informal, angrier, and often explicitly attacks the target, whereas generalized hate speech is dominated by religious hate and is characterized by the use of lethal words such as murder, exterminate, and kill, or quantity words also. So, I mean, directed hate speech, more personal, directed, angrier, generalized, actually using certain types of register. And we will see later on that this is, of course, something that linguists can draw upon, that certain types of words and also combinations of words tend to be used in spotting and identifying, for instance, generalized hate speech addressed to certain social groups or religious groups. This was hate speech. A related term or concept is toxic speech. Okay, it's a concept that's used, for instance, in language philosophy by a colleague of mine in the US, for example, Lynn Terrell. So you have this on the next slide, on slide 11. And I think it suffices if you just look at the second bullet point here. So toxic speech may explicitly use offensive slurs, but more commonly it does not explicitly use derogatory terms, and it still has toxic effects. If you just go to the next slide, the whole concept of toxic speech originates, for instance, in the publications of a famous Romance scholar in the Nazi time, who was Jewish, in fact, and who documented in his diaries how the life in Germany at that time became more and more intoxicated, also via language. Okay, so he actually, if you just look at this quote, Nazism permeated the flesh and blood of the people through single words, idioms, and sentence structures. What happens if the cultivated language is made up of poisonous elements? Words can be like tiny doses of arsenic. They are swallowed unnoticed, appear to have little effect, and then after a little time, the toxic reaction sets in after all. And you will see also in what I'm going to present in the following later on, that, for instance, the use of certain metaphors, the use of certain combinations of words help to frame certain groups in a certain way. And this framing may be on a fairly subtle basis, but it's something that sinks in. And if you do this on a wide basis, on a broad basis, and you do it repeatedly, there is something happening to the people who receive this kind of language. A third concept that or another related concept to hate speech is dog whistles. You see this on the next slide in 13. So a dog, as a dog whistle, we consider an utterance whose full meaning is only understood by at most a subset of audience members. And it's known from political advertising as implicit political messaging with the aim of manipulating the people that read what you've produced or that listen to what you are saying. And what is, of course, most dangerous in this respect is, on the next slide, what is simply covert dog whistles, but intentional covert dog whistles. For instance, there was a deliberate campaign. So if you just go to the very right part, to the right column on this slide, there was a deliberate campaign in the US to associate the term welfare with Black people. Okay, so you just used welfare in all sorts of contexts that ultimately were derogatory intended when talking about Black people. And this dog whistle functions without the conscious awareness of those whose racial attitudes are activated by the term. So covert dog whistles are in fact also something, a concept that one should keep in mind concerning related concepts to hate speech. Okay, what I would like to, if we just move on to 2 more slides, to slide 16, and if you just look at the bottom, what I would like to do then in the following, I would like to focus and present some studies that have been published in and on the situation of hate speech in the European Union, the United States, Southeast Asia, and in the Middle East. I will not be able, I'm not sure whether I can manage all of them, but I will try to mention some of them at least. And 2 projects that were conducted in the European Union, and one of them may in fact be still ongoing. I couldn't find information on this, are the ones on the next 2 slides or 3 slides. The one is the so-called so the Contact project that investigates. No, it's slides 17 and 18 first. So you have to go, yeah, okay. So out of the one project, a publication has arisen already from 2017, online hate speech in the European Union. And on the next slide, you can see that this was based on the study of online data from 10 EU member states, and the identification of hate crime was in fact at the center of this. And on the next slide, you see a second project, which has the acronym FARM. And FARM, well, you see it dissolved on the slide, stands for Preventing Hate Against Refugees and Migrants. And the major aim is also identified there, monitoring and modeling hate speech in Greece, Spain, and Italy to predict and combat hate crime, etc., etc. So from Italy, it was a group from Milano that is part of this. This project started in 2019. I'm not quite sure whether it's still funded, but normally EU Horizon 2020 programs should be funded for at least 2 or 3 years. Okay, so in the next part of the presentation, it's a part, however, that I will make very short because I don't think you want to learn so much about linguistics this afternoon. Nevertheless, I just wanted to say that if you are working with language as a professional linguist, you have different fields and approaches that are relevant to the exploration of hate speech. So Massimo, if you go to the next slide, 20, then you have fields like pragmatics, which studies meaning in context, as it is primarily interested also in how intentions are coded in language, or how you can identify what is meant from what is literally said. So pragmatic methods are relevant. Language philosophy is relevant. The study of cognitive linguistics and especially of metaphors is interesting, and also the study of frames is something that I will also highlight later on. Of course, you will see as soon as you look at internet data that much of this work is quantitative, okay? On the one hand, you do qualitative analysis, like critical discourse analysis, and this, say, would be stuff that, for instance, sociologists are greatly interested in. But of course, if you have large amounts of data, then of course you can also train algorithm on spotting certain types of language, and this helps you ultimately also if you are running, let's say, a social medium like Facebook, for instance, or Twitter, to clean your tweets and also to prevent, for instance, certain people from tweeting. So there is a quantitative and a qualitative element in these linguistic strategies. I want to briefly address, let's say, 2 or 3 of those that you see in bold print here. So I will just talk about frame theory, perhaps to start with, on the next slide. So frames are grounded in our cognitive and epistemological knowledge, and they show us how this knowledge has been structured by our previous experiences. And frequent patterns of usage represent speakers' knowledge of their language, including the conceptual structures that motivate them. And therefore, we can hypothesize that, for instance, and this is just an example from one article which I thought is relevant because it relates to a religious group, therefore we can hypothesize that concepts such as Islamic are organized in frames that govern our thought and our everyday functioning, and that the frequency patterns that we find of lexical co-occurrences provide us with data to identify and describe those frames. So what simply happens is you would look at what are the most frequent semantic neighbors and also the immediate neighbors to the right and left of words like Islam, Islamic, or Muslim, Muslimic, etc. And if you do this in large databases, then you actually see how often certain things combine with each other. And this also tells you something about framing. What is also relevant is critical discourse analysis as a second, let's say, more qualitative method in linguistics. And this is on the next slide. And critical discourse analysis investigates how societal power relations are established and reinforced through language use. So manipulation of discourse by politicians is one thing that has been investigated in a great deal. On the next slide, 23, you also find an elaboration of what is meant by critical discourse analysis. And those people who practice this really have a solid ground in sociology. And what they are interested in are discursive representations of individuals, groups, events, issues, phenomena, and relations. And these are both constituted by and constituted of the socio-political status quo of these entities. So the way we talk about certain people also gives us a hint as where we see these people in our society. Do they have a majority, minority status in terms of power relations? Do they stand above us, below us? Do they belong, let's say, to the same social stratum, for instance? And since contemporary public discourse abounds in messages of hate, and research findings demonstrate that there exists a link between verbal and physical aggression, it seems vital to this research group in the EU to explore the dynamics of hate speech production and reception in the public sphere in the media. Okay, now how does critical discourse analysis do this? This leads us to slide 25. So again, something I will just briefly mention without wanting to go into too much detail. But what is simply most important is that quantitative analyses really assist critical discourse analysis in a strong way. Critical discourse analysis typically is qualitative, but of course it can be supported by quantitative methods. And these are methods that we know from corpus analysis. So you look at combinations of words, which 2 or 3 word combinations appear most frequently. So N can go from 2 words appearing next to each other up to, I don't know, 10 words appearing next to each other, and also frequent collocations. A second method is what is known as sentiment analysis or emotion analysis. I can give you one brief example later on. And in general, critical discourse analysis is supported by algorithms and web interfaces for automatic detection of hate speech. So, for example, there exist large electronic dictionaries already of hate speech, and you can sort of run this entire dictionary, or you can run a given internet text or a certain tweet or whatever, or 10,000 tweets through this dictionary, and you get already an immediate indication of how much hate speech is in these tweets that you scanned. Okay, so this I just wanted to mention at this point. Maybe I just go to slide 27, because this is something that simply may strike you as interesting. So in what is known as sentiment analysis, words or word combinations are looked at against a precompiled so-called sentiment dictionary. Okay, this is typically crowdsourced, and you simply classify the individual words that you find in this dictionary on a numeric scale from +5 to -5 in terms of how positive or how negative a certain sentiment is, or you may also use such a scale in order to identify how much or to which degree do certain words express joy, express negative feelings like fear or disgust, etc. And once you have sort of classified your dictionary with regard to certain of these criteria, then again, you can run a given set of tweets, for example, or internet data against this dictionary, and you actually see how in a given text you have a certain distribution of positive or negative sentiments that are found. I don't want to go into practical examples here. You see here it has been. You can do this for literature works. You can do this for individual chapters of, for instance, Alice in Wonderland or whatever. But this is these days actually used to investigate and to scan online data. Okay, I would like to move on rather to the importance of metaphors. And I would like to move on to slide 34 in this respect. Let me just check whether I'm not skipping too much here. No, let us go to 31. Sorry. Yes. So in the next 10 minutes, and then I will stop. I would just like to give you some examples of studies that have been conducted. But one thing I should say to start with, and this is actually summarized on this slide. So the preferred targets of hate speech are religious groups, refugees, migrants, it's racism and ethnic minorities that are addressed, and sexual orientation is actually a very preferred target of hate speech. So what I want to say is that religion-related hate speech is not the most frequent type of these. Okay, so I will focus now on religion, but the others are equally or even more frequently found if you look at hate speech studies. So I will rather move then to some examples of religion-based hate speech, and so I will jump to slide 38. Yeah. And here there is a study by two scholars from the Autónoma in Barcelona who looked at a large Spanish language web corpus, and they looked also at the Twitter corpus of the main political parties, and they looked at 4 major digital newspapers. So their corpus consisted of these 3 sources, and what they were interested, and this is what you see on the next slide, were the most frequent collocations that one can identify if one is interested in the question, what about the notion of Islamic on the one hand, and Muslim, Muslimic, Musulman, etc. On the other hand? Okay, are these terms? Do these terms appear with different kinds of words, and are the frames, or is the framing of these 2 groups of words different? This was sort of their starting research interest. And in fact, what they did find was that the adjective Islamic is frequently used with a violent concept such as terrorism. And this indicates a conceptual contiguity between terrorism and Islam, and that terrorism is part of the framing conveyed by the word Islamico. And 2 main results then of this study are also summarized on the next slide. So first of all, as you can see, there is a negative framing that links Muslims to terrorism, but secondly, this negative framing is referred to with the adjective Islamico. Even though Musulman could be understood as a synonym, it is used in more neutral or even positive frames related to culture and contemporary politics or society. So, so there is in fact even a positive shift if one compares, again, in this Spanish online corpus, if one compares the use of Islamico with Musulman or Arab. Okay, so this was one finding from this Spanish study, and as a result of this research, sorry, okay, we could just go to the next slide. Yeah, so so one can say yes, there is a certain kind of stigmatization of Muslims in Spain, but it's done primarily by the use of Islamico, etc. But the major statement is the next one. If the detection of stigmatizations is, as pointed out by the expert, the first step in escalating into hate speech and hate crime, online discourse about Muslims in Spain should be considered as worrying. So what they are saying is, if we spot these kinds of framing tendencies, okay, then this is something that needs to be observed because it may lead to higher and stronger degrees of stigmatization. All right. On the next slide, or on the next 2 or 3 slides, I would like to present a study by El Sharif and others. So this was a team of 5 colleagues from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And what they did, they looked at 1% of 18 months of Twitter public streamed tweets. And for their study, what is relevant again is the distinction between directed and generalized hate. So what they actually spotted in their analysis of all these tweets from collected over 18 months was that one can really identify generalized hate against certain groups. And you see this on, for instance, the slide 46. Just by using these wordles, for example, so the top entity mentioned, if you just read the legends of figure 4 at the bottom of the slide, they just produced wordles from these most frequently mentioned words in directed and generalized hate speech. And what they simply identify is that if you look at directed hate speech, like in A, you have far more frequently, also if you look at those things that you can't read here, you have far more frequently person names, for instance, whereas in generalized hate speech, you have primarily religious and ethnicity words, so that you actually go against entire groups. Okay, and this is also what they found in further studies, which we can look at in the discussion if you want to. So the next 2 slides actually also show you that the most interesting differences between generalized and directed and direct hate speech can be found for religious hate speech. Okay, just to conclude then, or to give you one more example, and this is an example on slides 49 and following. So here there was a study by 3 computer scientists from the universities in Saudi Arabia and in Boulder, Colorado. And they were interested by religious hate speech in the Arabic Twitter sphere. And just by way of introduction, it may be interesting to know that 6 of the 11 countries with the highest social hostilities index, so this is a measure of crimes partly motivated by religion, 6 of the 11 countries with the highest social hostilities index have Arabic as an official language. And what they studied was the following. This is what is indicated on slide 50. They actually collected for 6 different religious groups, 1,000 tweets each, And they actually then looked at the amount of hate speech that you will find in each of these tweets, and they were interested also against which other social religious groups, for instance, is this hate directed. And about 50% of what they actually found in these 6,000 tweets altogether were concerned with religion, and often actually involved hate speech, especially, this is perhaps not too surprising, towards Jews and towards atheists. We could look at this in greater detail on the next two slides again, but maybe this is something that we can do in our discussion, because they actually looked at each of these 1,000 tweet sets. And for instance, on this slide, you can see that the percentage of tweets labeled as hate against each of the religious groups. So about 60% in these tweets were directed against Jews, 56% towards atheists, 49% towards Shia, so 50-50 between Sunni and Shia, and 36% against Christians in general. So you can actually identify, however, regularly religious-based hate speech in this Arabic Twitter sphere. Okay, let me just conclude on this with the last two slides, where I just wanted to point out and also come back to what I said at the beginning. So if we go to slide 53 now, that from the point of view of linguistics, there are no specific mechanisms that distinguish religion-based or religion-relevant hate speech from hate speech in general. Okay, so the kinds of methods that I presented to you are used for spotting any kind of hate speech. So there are no new breakthrough insights by linguists that I could present. But I think what is important is that in the relevant studies, if you are interested in hate speech, want to explore it, linguistics offers quite a number of concepts, theories, and methods for spotting and seeing through hate speech, and I really and also for seeing through the linguistic, communicative, etc. mechanisms that give rise to this hate speech. And therefore, I fully agree with the authors of the European Union Compact project that linguists should be part of the collaboration, just as scholars in religious studies, of course, when we want to. And now we should move to the next slide. And you look at the very bottom of this next slide. So we should all join forces, really, if we want to collaborate and enter into a constructive dialogue in order to automatically, or in general, to detect hate speech, because it is there that societal disruptions are not only mirrored, but they are also started. Okay, so language simply, this is a title of a famous book in linguistics. Language is a loaded weapon in many different respects, and hate speech, especially what we could have observed ever since the social media came about and the internet became so powerful, and hate speech is really the worst of all. Okay, thanks a lot.